Hello, I'm Mary Ito, and welcome to the Cram Podcast. Well, women, like men, are perfectly capable of bad behavior. But it wasn't easy to be bad way back when. Take the Roman Empire, for example. Not only did women not have power, for the most part, they were expected to be on their best behavior, to be good girls, wives, and mothers. Sound familiar? And if they weren't, well, there were some serious consequences, possibly death. But despite risks involved, there were some notable, badass women of antiquity. Alison Keith is here to talk about them, about why and how they resorted to dirty deeds and the price they paid. She's a professor of classics at Victoria College, University of Toronto, and director of the Jackman Humanities Institute. Hi, Alison.
Hello, Mary.
What a neat, meaty, sensational topic to delve into.
Absolutely.
You know, why do you think these stories about, so-called bad women of antiquity who lived several thousands of years ago, why are they still compelling to us today?
Well, I think for a couple of reasons. I mean, the mythical stories of the Amazons, of the Maenads, of Medea, they resonate now for reasons that even feminism has brought forward, we might say, right? And there remain with us women who reject society altogether, who want to make it in a world of women, world without men, like the Amazons.
Yeah. So talk about, you mentioned Medea.
Yes, Medea, such a rich figure. So in the earliest version of the myth that we know of, and this is the version of the myth before the great Athenian playwright Euripides, we know that Medea was, she was a Colchian. She was a barbarian from the shores of the Black Sea, so very far away from the Greek world. And she was smitten when she saw the great leader of the Argonauts, Jason. He was so handsome. She fell in love with him as soon as she clapped eyes on him. And he was trying to get the golden fleece back from her father. Her father didn't want to give it back. It was important token for his rule as well. And so Medea decided to help the handsome stranger. And indeed, she helped him so much that she basically had to flee her own family, the wrath of her father. And so she persuaded Jason to take her back with him to Greece to marry her. And the story of what happened once she returned to Greece with Jason is really a cautionary tale for why good Greek boys should not marry foreign witches. And if you're nice to them, that's one thing, but don't bring them home, no matter what. So they ended up having 2 children. And in the earliest form of the myth, as Jason was trying to establish his Greek citizenship and Greek ambitions in Corinth, he was going to marry the daughter of the king. But there was this awkward fact that he already had a kind of a wife, a barbarian witchy wife. Nonetheless, he also had 2 sons. And in the earliest version of the myth, the Corinthians killed the sons. It wasn't Medea. It was Euripides who changed the myth in his wonderful play called Medea and made her the killer of the children in order to punish Jason for breaking his oath to her.
That's so interesting. So, and my understanding is there were many incarnations of Medea, right? Various writers.
Yes.
Was she, so when it changed, when the story changed, did it tend to make her look worse? Like, did she become more evil?
Well, so that's, of course, a great question. Euripides is known as the biggest woman hater, but many feminists who've read and many teachers of classics who've read and taught the play find her arguments very compelling, at least at the beginning. Jason has broken his oath. He is treating his family very badly, but where do you get off your agreement? What part of the slippery slope of your agreement with Medea, where do you start to disagree with her? because you disagree with her when she murders her own children, right, to punish her husband.
Okay, so that's Medea. What about Clytemnestra? Tell us the story about her.
Clytemnestra is another very wicked woman of Greek myth. Clytemnestra was Helen's sister, the mythical Helen for whom the Trojan War was fought. And Clytemnestra was the wife of the great commander, Agamemnon, who was left at home for the 10 years of the Trojan War. And while she was left alone at home, she took up with Agamemnon, her husband's cousin, Aegisthus, who wanted the rule of Argos himself. So she was unfaithful to her spouse, to her husband. She was also ruling Argos. She was supposed to be ruling it, keeping the kingdom warm for Agamemnon. And instead, she kind of handed it over to Agamemnon's arch enemy, Aegisthus. So none of that was good. But the worst thing that she did was that when Agamemnon returned home, the great victor over Troy with all the spoils, the purple regalia, the gold, and possibly Cassandra, his mistress, in his train, Clytemnestra murdered him, killed him with an axe in his bath. Can't get much worse than that.
So when Clytemnestra took up with Aegisthus, what do we know about her intent with that? I mean, was she...
Yes.
Right? Well, so I'm wondering, was she being manipulated by him, or was that intentional on her part?
Or was it both? Yes. So Clytemnestra was nursing quite a bit of resentment against Agamemnon because Agamemnon was the father of her 3 children, Iphigenia, Orestes, and Electra. And Agamemnon, after he'd mustered the whole Greek fleet at Aulis, the fleet was becalmed, was unable to sail to Troy because somebody had gone hunting in Artemis, the goddess of nature's park. They'd killed an animal sacred to Artemis, and Artemis refused to allow the winds to blow. And Agamemnon learned to his horror that in order to get the winds to blow, to take him to Troy, where of course his ambition was to conquer Troy and bring home all the loot, the spoils, he would have to kill his own daughter. And so he wrote to Clytemnestra and he said, "Oh, honey, guess what? Good news. The foremost warrior of all of Greece, Achilles, has agreed to marry our daughter, Iphigenia." So Clytemnestra brought Iphigenia to Aulis, only to watch her husband sacrifice their firstborn child on an altar to the goddess Artemis.
And that's okay?
And so, yes, the resentment festered. So this was just another way to gain revenge.
Yeah. Okay. Let's talk about as well the Maenads, those worshippers of Bacchus.
Let's do it.
Yeah.
So Euripides also wrote the tragedy of the Bacchants, the Bacchae, the Maenads, these women who worship Dionysus, Bacchus, and who show the effects of the god in everything they do, so that they run amok outside of the city walls. They leave culture behind for nature. They embrace nature, and they are full of the god, enthusiastic. And it's as if they're intoxicated with Dionysus and his powers as a god of intoxication. And they...
so are they out of control? That's what it sounds like.
They're completely out of control. Completely out of control. And they do all the things in nature that you do not do in culture, in civilization. So one of the things they do is they come upon wild beasts in nature and they tear them limb from limb. The other thing is that when a whole bunch of women get together and they're running around in a crowd, men of the city, men of civilization and culture, assume that they're getting up to no good sexually. So the king of Thebes, Pentheus, Dionysus' cousin, There are a lot of cousins involved in these stories too. He gets it into his head that the women are out running amok sexually. And he's very concerned about this because not only have all the women of Thebes left, they're running around out in the countryside, but his mother and his aunts are out there too. So he sneaks out to spy on what the women are up to. Unfortunately, they catch sight of him, but in their maddened, intoxicated, enthusiastic state, they fall upon him and they think he's a wild beast, and they tear him apart, limb from limb from limb. And the women who actually tear him apart are his mother and his aunts.
Gruesome.
Pretty bad.
Gruesome,
story.
yeah. So I'm interested in knowing, these stories were written by men.
As far as we know.
Okay, yeah. You're okay. As far as we know, yeah. Because, they were the ones in power, right? I mean, they were able to write these stories, and yeah.
They were the ones who had access to the education.
Right.
Had access to reading and writing, who had access to training the choruses for the civic religion, which is where all these tragedies were originally produced for.
Yeah. So what's your take about why they depicted women in this way?
Well, there are many reasons to do it. I mean, the tragedy is a form in which the hero suffers a terrible fall from grace, let us say. So he must be punished. He has to come to a tragic end. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a tragedy. The women are often the agents of the hero's comeuppance, let us say. But these stories really magnify a set of themes founded on not just gender difference, and not just on a battle of the sexes, but on a hierarchy of the sexes that puts men on top in positions of power as the positive pole representing order, and women at the bottom as the negative characters who represent anarchy, disorder, chaos, none of the things you want to afflict your city-state. So these are all ultimately, or can be read ultimately, as justifications for males controlling access to political power. Patriarchy.
Yeah, because, it strikes me, Clytemnestra is left alone, and then she joins forces with her cousin, or with his cousin, her husband's cousin. And then, with the Maenads, this is what happened, right? When you let women on their own to form groups, they go crazy and they have these sexual escapades, etc., right? Don't leave these women alone. They're not to be trusted.
That's so true. They can't be trusted. They can't govern either themselves or anyone else, right? And they can't even take care of a man's kingdom, right?
Okay, so let's move on now into the Roman era. We're just going to skip through these eras and empires, but anyway, lots of ground to cover. You know what really, what's so surprising I find about the Roman era is, they look back at the Greeks, and these are stories and myths and all that kind of thing, but the Romans really did it. There's the story of Mark Antony and his wife Fulvia, which anyway, I'm going to have you tell it. And then let's talk about it.
In the aftermath of Julius Caesar's assassination, there were two factions that continued the civil wars. There were the Republicans who had murdered Caesar and wanted to go back to Republican government, and there were the Caesarians who included Mark Antony, who was the consul when Caesar was killed, and a guy named Octavian, who's going to be the future emperor, Augustus, the first emperor, who was Julius Caesar's great nephew. He was 19 when Caesar was assassinated, and he raised an army to go and avenge his great uncle's assassination. So in the beginning, Antony and Octavian make common cause against the Republicans. They defeat them at the Battle of Philippi in 42. But then, of course, they fell out amongst themselves. And the civil wars and the jockeying for power continued. So the following year, in 41, things came to a head, not in fact between Mark Antony and Octavian. Mark Antony was in the East, trying to mop things up in the East. Octavian was at home in Italy, and he fell out with Mark Antony's brother, Lucius Antony. And on Lucius Antony's side was Mark Antony's wife, Fulvia, the infamous woman to whom you referred.
Wait, let me just stop you. Sure. Is this pre-Cleopatra then?
Yes, it is.
Right. Okay. So Fulvia is the wife of Mark Antony. Okay.
She is the wife of Mark Antony.
Yes.
Mark Antony might be off in the East actually meeting Cleopatra at this time. He hasn't met her yet.
Okay.
Or at least at Rome, they don't know that he's met her. And Fulvia, like Lucius Antony, they both think that they are protecting Mark Antony's interests at Rome from Octavian, who's trying to win all the renown for himself at Rome. And so they actually end up fighting against those two factions end up fighting against one another. There is a battle at Perugia, one of the most lovely Italian cities.
Oh, yes.
And in the run up to the battle, we are told by the ancient sources that Mark Antony's wife, Fulvia, dons a suit of armor. She gives out the watchword to the troops, and she harangues the troops. She gives them a battle speech. This is what Lucius Antony should be doing, not Fulvia. So this is, as far as the Romans are concerned, this is the most wicked thing that could happen. And then...
I gotta stop you. That seems bizarre. And that really, it seems hard to believe that in those times, a woman, and especially this wife of Mark Antony, would don armor and go into battle.
Yes, and it's not going to stop with her. She foreshadows what's going to happen with these female relatives of the emperors who have access, uniquely privileged access to the ruling warrior, the ruling military man, the ruling general. Yeah, exactly. So it's very wicked in Roman terms. It's so wicked that it was easy for Octavian to circulate this terrible story after he actually won. And he could say, oh, the Antonian forces lost that battle because they allowed women to address the troops, women to command the army. They didn't do the proper manly thing of keeping their women shut up.
Well, okay. So then how did this reflect on Mark Antony? She is his wife.
She is his wife.
Yes.
Well, so Mark Antony was, he had a lot of luck until he ran out of it. So he was very lucky that he wasn't there, so he could disavow this bad behavior. And what was the really bad behavior? The loss, the military loss. Right? He could disavow the loss. He could throw his brother and his wife under the bus, not least because Fulvia actually had to flee Italy. She had no money. She washes up in Greece en route to join Antony, but she died in Greece before she could, in fact, be reunited with him. So Antony was really lucky. He could just disavow the entire episode. And he and Octavian, they didn't kiss themselves and make up, but Antony, in fact, was very fortuitously widowed. He didn't have a wife, so he married Octavian's sister. Octavia, yes.
Okay. So, do we know at all? I don't know. I mean, do we even know what the motivation was for Fulvia to do something so bizarre like that?
Well, I do think she was supporting her husband's politics and his side.
Yeah, but isn't that kind of naive?
Is it? I don't know. No, I think Roman women, we have lots of evidence for them taking political positions. And in this period where Republican government has kind of broken down, there's just a series of strong men and they're all battling it out with one another for supreme power. We see a lot of women entering spaces of male politics, which they had never entered in the past. So Fulvia, to enter the military, that is never going to be okay for Roman women. But excuse me, at exactly this time, we actually hear of a daughter of an orator, Cicero's great rival, actually delivering a political oration in the forum before Mark Antony and Octavian and Lepidus, the triumvirs, because, and here's another wicked Fulvia story for you, the wealthiest matrons were going to be taxed by the triumvirs. They went to Fulvia. They tried to use decorous women's channels and go around outside of male channels and to work through female channels. So they went to the wife of Mark Antony and said, look, we don't make wars ourselves. You can't have our money. At least have that tax apply to fewer of us. And when she rudely would not see them, but threw them out unheard, they made their way into the public space of the Roman Forum. That is the site of Roman politics. And they insisted on having Hortensia address the tribunal of the triumvirs. So again, they blamed Fulvia for this unwomanly behavior.
Okay. And let's talk about, well, this is just a tragic story, about Emperor Augustus and his daughter and granddaughter and what happened there.
Right. So Augustus, having watched, and let us not forget that Mark Antony in the end allied himself with Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium, at which he was defeated by Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus, and his great general Agrippa. And that's how Octavian won it all, the entire empire. And one of the stories that Octavian, the Emperor Augustus, then promulgates is that the Republic deserved to fall because none of those Roman men, those politicians, were able to rule their women. They couldn't even rule their women. Well, they certainly didn't deserve to rule an empire, right? So Augustus had one child, a daughter named Julia, and he used her as his dynastic pawn. When she was 14, he married her to her first cousin, his sister Octavia's only son, by a different marriage from Antony, a guy named Marcellus. And they were married for 2 years, and Marcellus was clearly marked out as Augustus' successor to the imperial purple by that dynastic marriage. Then Marcellus died. So Augustus looked around for someone else he could designate as his heir, and he married Julia to his best friend, the general Agrippa, who was twice her age. And she bore to Agrippa 5 children, 3 sons and 2 daughters. One of her own daughters, in fact, was named Julia. And Augustus adopted her 2 eldest sons as his own, so that he then had sons as well as that daughter. Agrippa, unfortunately, died in 12 BCE after many years of pretty good marriage for Julia. And she was still of childbearing age, so Augustus could not let her continue unmarried, not least because he had actually enacted marriage and adultery legislation 6 years before Agrippa's death, in which he criminalized adultery. The state had had no interest in adultery before Augustus, and he required every woman of childbearing age to be married, including his own daughter. So he
married. That's huge, right?
It's very.
I mean, that's a bit, yeah,
because big change.
Yes, because now adultery has been criminalized. You can't have women, as you said, of childbearing age being single and just going around and doing whatever they want. And it almost sounds as if, that act, that legislation was either all a result or partly a result of what you had said earlier, that he felt all these men like Mark Antony, right? They were just letting women out of control. We need to do something about this, right? We need a law that's going to keep these women in place.
And the place is the house, the home, and their place is bearing children. That's exactly right. Now, they were actually rewarded for bearing children. Freeborn women who had 3 children no longer had to have a financial tutor. They could dispose of their funds the way they wanted to. Freed women who had 4 children were in the same happy position. They had control over their finances. So there were carrots as well as sticks. But it was definitely about, it was a symbol of Augustus' control over women.
Right. Right. And so then here's his daughter, Julia. Now she's lost what? 2 husbands?
He's lost 2 husbands.
Yeah.
She's going to have a husband. So he marries her to his wife's elder son, Tiberius. So those of us who are Roman history buffs will know that Tiberius eventually succeeds Augustus as the next Roman emperor. But Julia and Tiberius didn't get along very well, and Tiberius actually left Rome because he didn't want to hang out with her. And to make a long story short, Julia was eventually convicted by her father of adultery. And she was exiled, which was what his adultery legislation required, to a small island off the Italian coast. Her mother, not the current wife of Augustus, went into exile with her so that she wouldn't be alone. So that's a very unhappy outcome. And the people loved Julia. She was supposed to be a person of great sweetness of temperament. She loved jokes. She loved literature. She loved to read. Maybe she shouldn't have read some of these stories. Quite a mess or anything like that. And so they demonstrated to have her recalled to the peninsula and not left on the island. Anyway, when Augustus died in 14, poor Julia had been in exile for, 16 years. And Tiberius, far from recalling her, actually cut off her stipend, the little money that they gave her. She'd been forbidden alcohol for years. He cut off her allowance entirely, and she starved to death in the first year of his reign. Now that is holding a grudge,
I'll say. And that was all because she had committed adultery. And then
what is the problem with a woman who was the daughter of the emperor committing adultery? Well, on the one hand, obviously the emperor has to make an example of his daughter. Right. He has to apply the letter of the law to his daughter. But what is the problem for the emperor besides having to enact the letter of the law on his daughter? Well, if he's married her 3 times to the heir apparent, if someone is sleeping with her, is that a sexual crime or is that a political ambition? Right? And Augustus wasn't taking any chances with that. And neither was Tiberius.
Yeah. So you know what, that's it. Yeah. So just talk about that for a moment and how sex was used by men and women in order to gain power.
Sure.
It was, right? It's a way to the throne. It's a way to, yeah.
I'm just going to say, I think this is very clear in the case of Cleopatra, who was married to her brother. And it was very common in Egypt for the siblings, right, to marry one another, and they would be on the throne. She is supposed to have had an affair. It's very well documented with Julius Caesar. And she bore him a son, and she made the claim that the child was Caesar's by naming him Caesarion, right? A little Caesar. And she was actually living openly as Caesar's mistress in Rome before Caesar was assassinated. Upon his assassination, she fled right back to Egypt. And she deposed her brother and made her son her co-ruler. And then, Antony came along. And she found it useful to have an adult co-ruler. So the story goes that she seduced him. And that gave, to Romanize, that gave Cleopatra access to Roman power through Antony. And Antony played into her hands and against his own Roman interests by supposedly giving her children, giving away Roman provinces, Roman rule to her children. Mm-hmm. So yes, sex is never innocent when you're sleeping with the head of state.
Right.
It always has political ramifications.
Right. But it's not like women, they couldn't go into battle to gain power. I mean, Fulvia, well, look what happened to her. They couldn't.
No, exactly. No, exactly. So Julia, the daughter of Augustus, comes to this terrible, sad, sad end. And her daughter named Julia was also accused of adultery in 8 CE. And in this case, this does look like it was a clear-cut case of the political ambition of her paramour. So it starts to look like an assault on the arrangements for Augustus' succession that Augustus has not been privy to because it's happening in his granddaughter's bedroom, right? And so the paramour is killed and Julia is exiled. And it reads a lot more like a political coup.
Yes. So what is the story, though, about Agrippina? This was Claudius's fourth wife. Yeah, fourth wife.
Claudius had a succession of really unfortunate marriages. I think there can be no question about it. So the fourth wife is Agrippina the Younger. So the daughter of Agrippina, the sister of Julia. One can get lost in all of these.
Yeah.
They all have the same name. So it's even more confusing. But Agrippina the Younger had been married to a guy named Domitius, and Domitius Nero, in fact, and she had borne him one son, and her son will eventually become the Emperor Nero. And she was very ambitious for her son. She wanted him to be the emperor. So Claudius had put away his third wife and killed her, and we might talk about that as well, because that's quite a terrifying story, too. Talk about women behaving badly. But Agrippina sort of cozied up to Claudius. She flirted with him. They had to change the law in order for Claudius to be able to marry Agrippina, who was his niece. Roman marriage laws did not allow marriage for relatives in such a close degree. And when he married Agrippina, perforce Nero moved into his household too, but he had 2 kids from his third wife, a son, Britannicus, but who was younger than Nero, and a daughter, Octavia. And so Agrippina ended up being quite impatient to get her hands on the levers of power. And the story goes, it's widely believed that she poisoned Claudius. He ate a dish of mushrooms. They knew he was very partial to them, and he died. And that is how Nero succeeded. On the throne. So Agrippina, her career actually shows you what Augustus was worried about with his daughter Julia and with his granddaughter Julia. Agrippina actually succeeded in marrying the emperor and bringing her son to the imperial purple.
So what does that say?
And what does that say? Indeed?
It doesn't matter what legislation you have in place.
So you have to break the law every time, apparently. Yes. And the thing is, Nero eventually murders his stepbrother, Britannicus, but he was also required to marry his stepsister, Octavia, to secure the legitimacy of his reign, right? Because she was the daughter of the previous emperor, too. So it gets very complicated, but I need hardly say he put her away. He divorced her because he saw her as a threat to his legitimacy on the throne.
Okay, so just going back to Agrippina, it kind of reminds me of Cleopatra as well, and what some women, I mean, not all women, but what some women will do for power, not for them necessarily for themselves, maybe, but for their progeny, right?
Yes, and in Rome, there's a lot of evidence that women are ambitious for their sons, in particular, and for their daughters to make good marriages politically, right? Ambitious political marriages, and we see that from the early in the Republic all the way through the imperial annals, as it were. And Agrippina really shows you how far you could get, right? And very early on in the fourth emperor, already in the same times. Yes.
It strikes me, I mean, back then was everything, I mean, everything is political in one way or another, but really back then, was everything political? I mean, I'm talking even family relationship, today we can kind of separate, this is our family and this is outside of kind of the other politics. But back then, would you say there was even,
especially in the imperial house? Yes,
yeah,
it was all political.
It was all political.
I think, I don't think Julia really understood any of that. And she's at the very beginning of this new quasi-monarchical system. So she doesn't know. But Tiberius, he murdered various nephews. Like, he knew what he was doing. And people really played on his insecurity as an emperor, right? So
yeah, it's isn't it funny that we think, those daytime soap operas, that's so not true. That's so unreal. Like, no, that is like child's fairy tales compared to this.
Right. And then, of course, the thing is, it's not just the Roman emperors, right? I mean, it's the nobility anywhere, and later periods as well. Think of Henry VIII.
Yes.
And think of his wicked wives, if we must. Think of the French kings. Think of Louis XIV, the Sun King, right? And the mistresses who were jockeying for a position to get to the power that he controlled. No,
you're right. I'm just now running through my head of other, like Catherine the Great, the Medicis, Catherine and the Medici, badass women.
That's right. Women misbehaving, but they were a little more successful.
Yeah.
Because I do want to just point out that Agrippina, for all that she established her son on the throne, that son went on to kill her. So, Wait
a minute. Agrippina's son, was it Nero?
Nero, yes.
He killed his mother?
His mother, yes. Yes. Nero really was a bad guy.
Yeah. Is he the one? No. Which emperor was it? Something about
he fiddled while Rome burned.
Yes, it was him.
True. That's true. But I'm just going to say that he learned ambition from his mother. We actually know that she wrote her memoirs. She published her memoirs, and memoirs, that was the name given to the generals, the biography that he wrote. Right, it was his memoirs. Well, she wrote a memoirs too, and what wouldn't we give to have that book? It doesn't survive.
Oh, it doesn't survive because of the fires.
Because of the fires, yes. We're all burning down.
Yeah.
Under Nero, after Nero.
Yeah. It's fascinating because, originally when we were talking about, these bad women and the bad deeds they did, it's all a matter of perspective, really, right?
Well, yes.
It's murky. It's kind of this murky. Yeah.
And what are their bad deeds? Are they domestic? Are they familial? Right?
Mm-hmm.
Families, a series of family murders. Not when it involves the person who runs a huge Mediterranean empire. Right? Because then all the courtiers, all the senators, all the generals start to be affected by what's happening in the imperial family.
Yeah. How much? No, let me ask you this first. What do you think was common among, if you can even say what was common, but what was common among all these women, or a lot of these women, sort of like at the very root of the ones who wanted power? Given the system they were in, right? What was at the root of it, do you think?
I do think that the wives of the Roman military strongmen, they're trying to support their husbands' careers and thereby to promote their potential or real sons' careers, to promote them to power. Because Roman politics, it was a cutthroat business. The Romans, they controlled a vast empire because they sent out two generals every summer to find someone to march against and expand the empire. And when they stopped having external enemies, the Romans' own historians say, then they started looking at one another, right, as obstacles to their own one-man rule. And their womenfolk are just as caught up in the civic turmoil, right, and the civil wars, because if their own side doesn't win, if their own side loses, they could be killed too, right? I mean, so
Sure.
they do have a big political stake in what happens.
Yeah.
And they have no legitimate say in the politics or in the military maneuvering.
Yeah. But it's interesting that the way you phrase that, you put their husbands and or their sons first. You didn't put that. It wasn't as if they wanted the power. They wanted to make sure they would survive. You right? You didn't say that.
It's true. I mean, one suspects that Agrippina enjoyed power a great deal, right? And that she used sex to advance her own power too. No question about it. And she was really mad when Nero stopped listening to her because she thought she could be his first minister, right? So she, I think, clearly was interested in political power. I don't think that was Augustus' daughter Julia's interest. Yeah, she liked the gentleman, I would say.
Do you know? Again, I go back to the fact that these women and these stories. I mean, this happened so long ago, but why do you think it's important for us to know about them today? You know, to study them, to acknowledge them, and to really delve into them about why and how they did the things they did. What does that tell us about today?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, one of the reasons I'm interested in these stories, both the myths and the historical, facts, certainly they're massaged narratives by the historians, the ancient historians, is because those stories circulated as rationales for keeping women out of power. And those have had a very, very powerful and long-lasting afterlife. If it took until 100 years ago for women to get the vote, that's a really long time in the Western world for these stories to circulate, and we can point to their circulation in other times. I'll just point to, France and Racine and his reuse of the various Greek myths, right? They have a very long and I would argue very powerful afterlife in the political imaginary, let us say. And it's taken a really long time to, make some kind of inroads against them. Yeah.
Fascinating. Just a fascinating history. And I just love your perspective on all this, Alison. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Mary. It's a pleasure.
That's Alison Keith. She is a professor of classics at Victoria College, University of Toronto, and director of the Jackman Humanities Institute. For more information about her work and research, please check out our show notes. That's it for this edition of the Cram Podcast. Please follow us on social. Our handle is @CramIdeas. Hope you enjoyed our show. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you back here next time.